Before I tell you the sentence, I need to be honest with you about something, because what you are about to hear is not a magic trick, not a manipulation tactic, not some clever phrase designed to control someone else's nervous system against their will. It works precisely because it is not manipulation. It works because it removes the exact thing avoidant defenses depend on in order to keep functioning: ambiguity. And once you understand why this particular sentence lands so differently than anything else you might have tried, you will understand something considerably more valuable than a single phrase. You will understand the entire mechanism keeping you stuck in confusing cycles you never chose to be part of. The sentence is this: I don't need you to stay. Four simple words, delivered calmly, without anger, without ultimatum, without any hidden agenda designed to provoke a particular reaction. I want you to sit with how strange that sentence probably sounds as a supposed key to triggering panic, because everything you have likely been taught about relationships suggests the opposite should be true. That declaring you need someone, that begging them to remain, that demonstrating how much their departure would devastate you, should be the thing that finally makes them realize your worth. Let's talk about why this common assumption gets the entire mechanism backward. Let's talk first about what avoidant psychology actually depends on in order to maintain its usual defensive operation, because understanding this dependency explains everything about why this particular sentence lands so differently than desperate pleading ever could. Avoidant patterns function through a specific, reliable formula, one where a partner's visible need creates a predictable script. Distance activates pursuit. Pursuit confirms continued availability. Continued availability allows the avoidant partner to maintain control over the relationship's pace without ever needing to fully commit or fully engage. This formula depends entirely on your need remaining visible, remaining active, remaining the reliable, predictable response to their own withdrawal. Let's talk about what happens specifically when this formula suddenly stops functioning as expected, because this disruption is exactly what the sentence in question produces. When you communicate genuine, calm indifference to whether they stay or leave, not performed indifference, not strategic coldness, but authentic release of the anxious need that previously characterized your response, the entire predictable script collapses. There is no pursuit to expect. There is no anxious return to count on. The reliable formula they have built considerable unconscious security around simply stops producing its expected output, and this disruption registers, often quite powerfully, as genuine threat. Let's talk about why removing your needs specifically produces panic rather than simple indifference or simple relief on their end, because this distinction matters enormously for understanding the actual mechanism at work. Avoidant individuals often carry, buried beneath considerable defense, a quiet fear that they are fundamentally difficult to love, fundamentally destined toward eventual abandonment regardless of how hard anyone tries to remain close. Your continued need, however exhausting it may have felt for you to maintain, functioned as ongoing, if painful, evidence against this fear, proof that despite everything, someone still wanted them enough to keep trying. Removing that need does not simply remove your presence. It removes the evidence contradicting their deepest fear, leaving that fear suddenly, uncomfortably unopposed. Let's talk about what makes this sentence specifically more powerful than simply walking away in complete silence, because silence alone, while it eventually produces similar effects, often takes considerably longer to register clearly and leaves considerably more room for alternative interpretation. Silence can be explained away, attributed to busyness, to normal relationship friction, to any number of alternative causes that avoidant psychology readily reaches for in order to avoid confronting the more threatening interpretation. A direct, calm statement removes this interpretive wiggle room entirely, stating plainly and unambiguously that the anxious pursuit they have grown accustomed to no longer exists, without leaving space for comfortable alternative explanation. Let's talk about why this sentence must be delivered with genuine calm, rather than with anger or with dramatic flourish, in order to produce its intended effect. Because delivery matters just as significantly as content here. A version of this sentence delivered angrily, as a weapon meant to hurt or to provoke, registers considerably differently than the same words delivered with genuine, settled peace. Anger still communicates activation, still communicates that you remain emotionally invested in producing a reaction from them. Genuine calm communicates something considerably more threatening to avoidant defenses: authentic release, evidence that your own stability no longer depends on their response at all. Let's talk about what this means practically regarding when and how this sentence should actually be used, because this entire discussion would be incomplete without addressing genuine application rather than simply theoretical mechanism. This sentence should never be deployed as manipulation, spoken with secret hope that it will trigger panic and thereby produce renewed pursuit, because that hidden agenda undermines the very authenticity that makes it effective in the first place. It should only be spoken when it reflects genuine internal truth, when you have actually reached a place of authentic release, where their staying or leaving genuinely no longer determines your own sense of peace and your own sense of worth. Let's talk about what happens if you speak these words before genuinely reaching this internal place, attempting to perform the sentence strategically while still carrying considerable anxious need underneath the performance. Avoidant individuals, precisely because their own defenses developed through hypervigilant attention to relational authenticity, tend to detect this gap between performed calm and genuine calm remarkably effectively. A performed version of this sentence, spoken while genuine anxious need remains active beneath the surface, often produces the opposite of its intended effect, registering as manipulation rather than as authentic release. And manipulation, once detected, typically triggers even stronger defensive withdrawal than anxious pursuit ever did. Let's talk about what genuine internal release actually requires in order to develop authentically, because this represents considerably more significant work than simply memorizing a sentence to deploy strategically. Genuine release requires building actual internal stability, independent of this specific relationship, developing your own sources of meaning, your own sources of validation, your own settled sense of worth that does not fluctuate based on any single person's availability or any single person's response to you. This internal work typically takes considerable time, and rushing toward performing its outward appearance before genuinely developing its internal reality tends to produce hollow results, rather than the authentic transformation this entire discussion has been describing. Let's talk about what happens specifically once this sentence, spoken authentically, produces the panic response being described throughout this conversation, because understanding what typically follows matters just as significantly as understanding the initial mechanism. This panic often manifests as sudden, increased effort, questions about what changed, attempts to understand or reverse whatever shift has occurred, sometimes genuine vulnerability, previously withheld throughout the relationship's entire history. This response deserves the same measured evaluation discussed throughout every other conversation regarding avoidant behavior, distinguishing genuine, sustained change from temporary reaction to the discomfort of losing access to something previously taken for granted. Let's talk about the specific danger of interpreting this panic as definitive proof that authentic release functions as an effective strategy for producing lasting transformation. Danger worth naming directly, given how tempting this interpretation often becomes once the sentence produces its intended effect. Genuine, authentic release was never meant to function as manipulation disguised as peace, deployed specifically to trigger a desired reaction. If you find yourself immediately abandoning your own hard-won internal stability the moment panic produces increased attention, you have essentially undone the very authenticity that made the shift meaningful in the first place, returning to the same anxious, contingent stability that characterized your earlier position within the relationship. Let's talk about what genuine, sustainable use of this understanding actually looks like moving forward. Understanding applied not as a manipulation technique, but as an accurate description of what authentic internal security naturally produces. The goal was never to learn a clever phrase capable of controlling someone else's psychology. The goal is developing genuine internal stability so thoroughly that phrases like this one become simply accurate descriptions of your actual internal state, spoken naturally whenever relevant, rather than strategically deployed for calculated effect. This authentic stability, once genuinely developed, changes every interaction within the relationship, not just the specific moments when this particular sentence happens to be spoken aloud. Let's talk about what it means to hold this entire understanding with appropriate humility regarding what it can and cannot accomplish. Genuine, authentic release, communicated clearly and calmly, creates favorable conditions for potential positive change, disrupting a pattern that anxious pursuit alone typically cannot interrupt. It does not guarantee that change, and it does not obligate you to remain within a relationship indefinitely simply because this shift produced some initial encouraging reaction. The sentence itself was never meant to save every relationship. It was meant to accurately reflect genuine internal transformation. Transformation valuable entirely on its own terms, regardless of whether it ultimately produces the specific relational outcome you might hope for. Let's talk about what this understanding offers you specifically, beyond simply this single relationship's potential trajectory. Learning to build genuine internal stability independent of any single person's response teaches a skill considerably more valuable than any single sentence could ever provide on its own. This skill extends into every future relationship, every future circumstance requiring similar emotional maturity, protecting you from repeating the same anxious, contingent patterns regardless of who you eventually find yourself navigating connection with throughout the rest of your life. Let's talk about what genuine self-respect requires throughout this entire process. Self-respect that ultimately matters considerably more than whether this particular sentence produces panic, produces genuine change, or produces nothing observable at all. You are allowed to reach authentic release simply because it serves your own peace, entirely separate from whatever effect it might or might not produce within someone else's internal experience. This release belongs to you first, a gift you give yourself, rather than a tool deployed primarily for its impact on someone else's behavior. Let's talk about the specific physiological experience many people report the first time they genuinely mean these words, rather than simply saying them, because this internal shift deserves description beyond the psychological mechanism already discussed. There is often a distinct bodily sensation accompanying authentic release, a loosening in the chest, a steadiness in the breath that previously carried an anxious, shallow quality whenever this particular relationship came to mind. This physical shift typically arrives only after the internal work has genuinely settled, meaning noticing its presence or absence offers a useful, honest gauge for whether you have actually reached authentic release, or whether you remain, understandably, still working toward it. Let's talk about what specific internal work most reliably produces this genuine shift, work worth naming directly rather than remaining abstract. This typically involves deliberately redirecting attention and emotional investment toward your own separate life, rebuilding routines, friendships, and personal goals that exist entirely independent of this relationship's outcome. It involves consciously practicing self-soothing during moments of anxious longing, tolerating the discomfort of uncertainty without immediately seeking reassurance from the very person whose inconsistency created that uncertainty in the first place. It involves often processing considerable grief regarding what the relationship has and has not been able to provide. Grief that must move through fully, rather than being bypassed in pursuit of appearing calm prematurely. Let's talk about the specific timeline this internal work typically requires, because unrealistic expectations here often produce either premature, hollow performance of the sentence or unnecessary discouragement when genuine release takes longer to develop than initially hoped. Authentic release from significant anxious attachment to a particular relationship typically develops across many weeks at minimum, often several months, sometimes longer depending on the relationship's duration and depth. This timeline deserves patience rather than pressure, since rushing toward performed calm before genuine calm has developed tends to produce exactly the hollow, detectable performance already discussed as ultimately counterproductive. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own relationship with hope throughout this developmental process, because hope deserves careful examination given how central it likely was throughout the earlier, more anxious stages of this connection. Authentic release does not require eliminating hope entirely, becoming someone who no longer cares whether the relationship continues or improves. It requires instead holding that hope loosely, allowing it to exist without permitting it to dictate your emotional stability moment to moment. A considerably more sustainable relationship with hope than the desperate, anxious version that likely characterized earlier stages of this same relationship. Let's talk about a specific misconception worth addressing directly. The belief that authentic release means you no longer genuinely want the relationship to succeed, when in reality, release and genuine desire for connection can coexist entirely without contradiction. You can authentically release anxious need for a particular outcome, while still genuinely hoping that outcome eventually arrives. The crucial difference being that your peace no longer depends on that specific hope being fulfilled in order to remain intact. This distinction protects against the common, inaccurate assumption that reaching genuine calm somehow requires abandoning genuine care. Let's talk about what specific triggers tend to test this newly developed authentic release most significantly. Moments worth anticipating in advance so that their arrival does not automatically undo considerable prior progress. Renewed contact from them, particularly warm or vulnerable renewed contact, often tests this release most powerfully, tempting a return to old patterns of anxious hope and anxious investment. Significant dates, anniversaries, holidays previously shared together similarly test whether the release has genuinely settled or whether it remains fragile, easily disrupted by circumstances carrying particular emotional weight. Let's talk about how to navigate these testing moments without abandoning the authentic release you have worked to develop. Navigation that requires conscious, deliberate practice, rather than assuming stability will simply hold automatically, regardless of circumstance. This might involve deliberately pausing before responding to renewed contact, allowing enough time for the initial emotional activation to settle before deciding how or whether to engage further. It might involve preparing in advance for significant dates, planning meaningful, fulfilling activities that occupy your attention and provide genuine satisfaction, independent of the relationship's history with that particular occasion. Let's talk about what it means to view any temporary setback during this process not as failure, but as normal, expected texture within genuine psychological growth. If a particular trigger produces renewed anxious activation despite considerable prior progress toward authentic release, this does not undo everything previously developed. It simply indicates that the work remains ongoing, requiring continued practice rather than being treated as a permanently completed achievement immune to any future challenge whatsoever. Let's talk about what specific alternative phrasing might feel more natural, depending on your own communication style, since the exact words matter less than the authentic internal state they accurately reflect. Some people might find themselves naturally saying something closer to acknowledging that they want the relationship to work, but recognize it cannot be forced, or expressing genuine care alongside honest acknowledgement that they will be okay regardless of which direction things ultimately take. The specific wording matters considerably less than the underlying authenticity, meaning forcing yourself to use these exact 4 words if they feel unnatural to your own voice may actually undermine the very genuineness this entire mechanism depends upon. Let's talk about what happens specifically within a relationship's broader dynamic once one partner has genuinely developed this kind of authentic release, change extending well beyond the single moment when the sentence itself gets spoken. Authentic release tends to alter the entire texture of daily interaction, conversations feeling less weighted with anxious undertone, requests feeling less like desperate pleading and more like simple, clear communication of genuine preference. This broader shift often proves considerably more influential than any single sentence, however powerful, because it demonstrates sustained, consistent internal stability, rather than a single, isolated moment of calm that could easily be dismissed as temporary or circumstantial. Let's talk about what it means to communicate this authentic release without necessarily announcing it explicitly through any particular sentence at all. Because some people find that authentic internal shift naturally reveals itself through consistent behavior over time, rather than requiring explicit verbal declaration. This alternative path deserves equal validity alongside more direct verbal communication, recognizing that different personalities and different relationship dynamics might call for different approaches to expressing the same underlying, genuine internal transformation. Let's talk about the specific role self worth plays throughout this entire process. Self worth that must exist independently before authentic release becomes genuinely possible, rather than remaining merely aspirational. Attempting to develop authentic release while self worth still depends heavily on external validation, particularly validation from the very person whose behavior prompted this entire journey, typically produces exactly the hollow performance already discussed as counterproductive. Building genuine self worth first, through whatever combination of therapeutic work, supportive relationships, and personal accomplishment proves most effective for your own specific situation, provides the necessary foundation upon which authentic release can eventually develop naturally. Let's talk about what specific daily practices might support this foundational self worth development. Practices worth incorporating deliberately, rather than hoping self worth simply develops passively over time without active cultivation. This might involve regularly acknowledging your own accomplishments and your own positive qualities, countering the tendency towards self criticism that often develops during periods of relational confusion and relational inconsistency. It might involve deliberately spending time with people who reflect back genuine appreciation and genuine consistency, providing living counter evidence against whatever damage prolonged relational inconsistency may have caused to your own sense of worth. Let's talk about what it means to measure progress throughout this entire journey by your own internal experience, rather than by their eventual reaction. Measurement that protects against the common trap of treating their response as the primary indicator of whether your own growth has genuinely occurred. Success here means noticing your own increased capacity to tolerate uncertainty, your own reduced anxious monitoring, your own genuine engagement with your own separate life, markers entirely within your own observation and entirely independent of whatever they ultimately choose to do in response to whatever shift they eventually notice on your end. Let's talk about what genuine compassion for your earlier, more anxious self requires throughout this entire process. Compassion worth extending generously, rather than replacing anxious attachment with harsh self-criticism for having experienced it in the first place. The earlier version of yourself who needed them intensely, who could not have spoken these words authentically, was not weak or foolish. That version was responding reasonably to genuine attachment and genuine uncertainty, doing the best possible navigation available given the emotional resources present at that particular time. Honoring that earlier version with kindness rather than embarrassment supports healthier integration of the growth you have since developed. Let's talk, finally, about what it means to trust this entire process, even during moments when authentic release feels frustratingly distant, when anxious need still feels considerably more present than calm acceptance, despite genuine effort already invested toward developing it. This distance does not indicate failure. It indicates simply that the work remains ongoing, deserving continued patience and continued gentle practice, rather than harsh judgment for not yet having arrived at the destination this entire conversation has been describing throughout. Let's talk about the specific way this entire understanding applies beyond romantic relationships specifically, extending into friendships, family dynamics, and even professional relationships where similar patterns of anxious pursuit and avoidant withdrawal sometimes appear. The underlying principle remains consistent across these varied contexts. Authentic internal release, developed genuinely rather than performed strategically, tends to shift relational dynamics considerably more effectively than continued anxious effort ever could, regardless of the specific nature or context of the relationship in question. Let's talk about what it means to apply this understanding with genuine ethical awareness, recognizing the difference between developing authentic peace for your own well being and weaponizing calm specifically to manipulate someone else's emotional state. The entire framework discussed throughout this conversation only remains genuinely healthy when authentic release serves your own genuine peace first, with any effect on the other person's behavior remaining a secondary, unintended consequence, rather than the primary, calculated goal driving your own internal work. Let's talk about what specific warning signs might indicate you have drifted from genuine, authentic release back towards strategic performance. Warning signs worth monitoring honestly throughout this ongoing process. If you find yourself frequently checking whether your calm has produced the desired reaction, if you feel disappointed or frustrated when panic does not materialize as expected, if your internal peace seems to fluctuate based specifically on their response rather than remaining stable regardless of it, these signs suggest a return towards strategic performance rather than continued authentic release, deserving renewed attention and renewed internal work. Let's talk about what ongoing maintenance this authentic release requires, even once it has been genuinely established. Because psychological growth of this kind rarely represents a permanent, static achievement, immune to any future regression. Continued investment in your own separate life, continued practice of self-soothing during moments of uncertainty, and continued honest self-reflection regarding whether genuine calm or performed calm currently describes your internal state all support the ongoing maintenance of this hard-won stability over considerable time. Let's talk about what genuine hope looks like, specifically once this entire journey has been fully integrated. Hope that remains realistic, rather than either naively optimistic or unnecessarily cynical regarding what any particular relationship might ultimately become. This hope trusts that genuine, authentic living, prioritizing your own peace and your own growth, regardless of any single relationship's outcome, ultimately serves you considerably better than any strategy, however clever, ever could. Because authentic living builds a foundation that remains valuable and intact, regardless of how any specific situation eventually resolves. Let's talk about what remains true, regardless of whether this particular sentence or any variation of it ever actually gets spoken aloud within your own specific situation. The internal transformation this entire discussion has been describing carries value entirely independent of whether it ever produces the specific panic response used to introduce this conversation. You are not working toward authentic release in order to trigger a particular reaction from someone else. You are working toward it because a life built on genuine internal stability rather than on anxious contingency tied to someone else's inconsistent behavior represents a considerably better life, regardless of how any single relationship ultimately concludes. That life is available to you starting now, built one honest, patient choice at a time, regardless of what any single sentence, spoken to anyone, ever ultimately produces in return. Trust the process, trust your own timeline, and trust that the peace you are building right now is already, quietly, worth everything it has taken to get here. And so, if you have carried this sentence in your mind, wondering whether speaking it might finally produce the reaction you have been hoping for, I want you to redirect that wondering toward a more important question first. Have you actually reached the place where these words reflect genuine truth, where their staying or leaving genuinely no longer determines your own peace? If you have, speak them freely, not as strategy, but simply as honest reflection of who you have become. And if you have not yet reached that place, focus your energy there first, because the sentence itself was never really the point. The genuine internal freedom it reflects was always the actual destination worth pursuing.